everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Jason's Take On. Really excited to be here today, and we have a very special guest, Abby Hammer, who is the Chief Customer Officer at Churn Zero. Abby, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, fantastic. And today we're going to be talking about customer success and product alignment, and we're really excited about this topic. We think it's something that's really come up. It is increasingly coming up, and Abby is an expert in this area, so we're really looking forward to getting her thoughts as well, too. Before we jump on, I also want to welcome my co-host, Jason Noble in the UK. Hey, Jason.
Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Really excited about this. I think it has a nice tie-in with the podcast we did with Dave Jackson the other week as well, talking about kind of that alignment with the product team, and really some ideas as to what you need to do. So having Abby, where you've got that alignment of the title and the role covering both bits, is really nice. I think it's a brilliant follow-on podcast. So welcome.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. So Abby, before we jump in, do you want to just give a little bit about your background and Churn Zero and your role there to give people some sense of where you're coming from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Churn Zero. I'm also our Head of Product, which is where CS and product sort of collide underneath my title. I've been at Churn Zero since the very beginning, came on with our two founders. So it's, I've watched it grow from just an idea that we had at a previous organization where we were struggling with churn, trying to understand it, trying to get our hands around it. And that gave birth to the initial idea of Churn Zero, all the way to where we're at now. And I think about how CS and product should work together all the time, not only because I deal with it every single day, but even if I just look from one side or the other, I think CS is more effective when product is on its team. And I think product is more effective when CS is on its team. So I think the relationship between those two teams is really critical to a business's success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really exciting to see that in your organization that you're in charge of both, which is not normally the case in a lot of the organizations I've worked.
Yeah, it's an unusual combo for sure. It works well for us, given that we are a customer success organization. So it really keeps us tightly tied to our customers. But it has been unusual for sure.
Are you seeing other organizations doing the same? Are you seeing any trends there that people are bringing the two together?
I wouldn't say I'd see like a sweeping wave of it happening, but I am running into it a little bit more than I did a couple of years ago. I actually take note of it because when people see my title, if they have something similar, like, oh, hey, I never see anyone who looks like me, who does what I'm doing, and they get really excited to connect, as do I. So I don't see it formalizing a lot at many organizations, but I think for the organizations that have formalized it, it's been an interesting experience.
How do you find do you find the role being that you're doing product and customer success, or does it kind of all blend into one? And how do you balance your time between the two functions almost? Because that must be so difficult.
The answer to that varies day to day. I'll be transparent on that for sure. Just like anybody else, occasionally I can get taken by the wave of what needs my attention a little bit more on a day-to-day basis. But they do really intersect so much that even when I'm working on something that I might stamp as, oh, I'm doing customer success right now, or I stamp as, oh, I'm doing product right now. To do either of those really well, I end up crossing into the other side of it. And I have two distinct teams, but I also have those teams work together. Much more than I see in a lot of organizations, which forces that reciprocal relationship. Forces makes it sound like they're unwilling participants. They're very willing participants. So where my attention is sometimes varies. As we're coming up on big product launches, I may get pulled more towards product. As we're coming to the end of Q4 right now, CS is certainly trying to close out our year. So it varies, but I very rarely work in either one camp or the other.
That's great. So, taking sort of even a step back, when I talk to a lot of different organizations, and everyone has this, they use the term alignment a lot, but what does that actually mean? And how do you recognize it, or can you give some examples of what it means to be aligned between CS and product?
Yeah, so when I talk about this, either to customer success groups or to product organizations, I think the big thing that everybody needs to remember is that when customers renew, they renew on your solution, which is not just your product and it's not just your services. It's a combination of those two things together. And I think aligned teams are really good at reflecting that reality. That means that they have things like they agree on what an ideal customer is. They agree on what reasonable reach customers are. They have consistent and collaborative and formalized feedback loops between them. Those loops, going in both directions, not just one or the other. They have shared data insights. And ultimately, if both these groups are acting in a very customer-centric way, they need each other to be successful. And if they're doing that well, then we see this have this really lovely results on having products and having services that are just undeniably useful to customers, which usually yields high retention rates and even expansion with accounts. Those are some of the key things I see when I consider a team aligned. That's some of the stuff that I would typically want to see.
Wow, that's great. So how, especially when you're out talking with your customers, how can you recognize if your customers' teams are not fully aligned, or if there's a disconnect between what they're trying to do with their CS perspective and product, and how do you sort of help them navigate those waters?
Yeah, it can be a little tricky depending on where an organization is at with even trying to get those two teams to talk to one another, let alone be aligned. It could be a bit of a challenging conversation. Certainly any customer that we run into that has where the CS team reports, a lot of product misfit, or, a lot of customer angst or gaps in reality versus expectations. Usually those things come hand in hand with a higher churn rate, even if it's only for a certain segment of customers. So, if we're looking at the very end of like, where does this result, how well you renew customers, how well you expand customers, those can be some sort of indications of how successfully you're putting those two teams together. When we start to talk to customers about why do you do the processes that you do, why do you approach things the way that you do, we get into these interesting conversations around the gaps in their product that they're trying to fill. Every single product is going to have gaps of some sort, just because there's variation in the types of customers that you have. And teams that have a good relationship with product, their mentality around filling those gaps tends to be very different than teams that don't have a good relationship. That strife can be a real indication that there's room for improvement. Probably the biggest thing that we recommend and that I recommend to groups when they feel like they're, sort of mismatched with product is around formalizing how you talk to one another. It can feel stiff at first, but I think having clear ways that you should communicate and how that information should be delivered is really the beginning point of so many other things that you could do.
Have you got any examples of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes in both directions. So a lot of times, I tell a story a lot about back when I was just a PM, and I had a customer success manager run up to me, and like when I tell the story, I'm like, her hair was on fire. She was just like really, really animated, and she's like spewing off. I was just on the phone with this customer, and they're so mad, and they're not going to renew, and they can't believe that the product doesn't do X. Like, why wouldn't it do X? Like, I totally get her. And I mean, I tell that story because if I'm honest about how I walk away from that conversation, I didn't take in anything she said. It sounded like hyperbole. It sounded like some of it was, I was like, frankly, you're just being rude now. Like, it's just thinking about how that information was delivered allowed me to hear her and hear consistency in what she was experiencing and real risk for, for customers and also for her own personal livelihood. CSMs were tied to that renewal. I think one of the easiest places to get started that breeds some goodwill is around tracking product requests, customer product requests, I should say. Although, if you want to be inclusive, like include the sales team in this. What are prospects asking for that you don't have? So coming up with a system on how you capture that product feedback, rules about how it's captured and what information needs to be shared, when you deliver a piece of product feedback. And then also having, product be involved in that in the sense of, okay, I'm a CSM, I submit a piece of product feedback. Does that go into a black hole, or do I actually get a response from product, and in what kind of time frame? Is that a response I can share with the customer? So don't just say like, all right, I have a Google form or, a spreadsheet somewhere where you can go and fill out product feedback. Put a little thought into it. What you need to know when that feedback is collected, and then how you're actually going to respond to it. Because if at least everybody's centering around what customers are saying, or what prospects are saying, if you open it up to sales as well, it gives you a launching spot, and also gives you a quantitative launching spot is, I think, the most important thing. Because then instead of dealing in these hyperboles and these, anecdotes and these hair on fire moments, you've got something you can turn towards that helps keep the conversation much more focused.
That idea of kind of customer feedback falling into a black hole is something that I've seen in multiple organizations, multiple roles, and it's a very difficult thing to get out of that. How are some of the kind of standard ways of working that you've put in place? What are some of the specific things that you've done? I'd be really interested in hearing about those.
Yeah, I think when you collect feedback, it may sound strange, but I do think, two key things that I think are important that can help product decide how they move through. One, I do think it's interesting to ask the person giving the feedback, whether it's a salesperson or a CSM, for what they think the priority is. A lot of product teams don't do that because they assume they're going to get, everything is high priority, everything is a must-have. And that's actually not been my experience, especially if you, you don't just hand out the form, but you sit and you talk about what the expectations are. People want to be good actors in the scenario. They want their feedback to be taken seriously. So if you tell them how to classify these things, I think that gives you a really interesting point. Like if a CSM self-reports something as very low priority, on the product side, that gives me a little more breadth and space to respond to that versus something that feels more like a deal breaker. In the same vein, I also think it's really important to include the money. Ultimately, we are all, parts of an organization that's a business that's trying to make money. So if we can tie what we're asking for to dollars that are at risk or that were lost, that can be really influential for the product team as well. Not that we want to discount small customers in any capacity, but again, when we're talking about how much heat there is behind something, knowing whether those dollars were lower and lower priority versus, hey, this is deal breaker high dollars, can help set some of those standards. I do think it's important for product to strive to respond to everything. So you don't breed the habit of, well, I'm only going to report if it's for a big customer and a big deal. But I do think those two things can help figure out the right pace of feedback.
What was the journey like for the two teams then at Churn Zero? Because how did the two teams kind of mold together as one and come together? What's kind of the history behind it and the decision to actually say they're going to come under both the same executive?
Yeah, being super transparent, when I started at Churn Zero, I was our VP of product, and I took over customer success because we were still small at the time, and everybody wears 6 hats.
Yeah.
And I do have a background in customer success. That was the first part of my career. It was not called customer success then, but hindsight, I can tell that's what it was. So for me, it was a really lovely coming home moment. Of now these two sides of my career were sort of merging together in a really lovely way. And I think as we got started, we sort of always anticipated that at some point we'd branch them off. And it's just as we got going and we naturally formed these moments of feedback and, and collaboration between these teams, and we saw a lovely result it was giving us. That's where we started opening up to the idea of, hey, maybe it is working to have these two teams, be underneath the same person, which has a nice effect of making it really hard for them to get too separated. Let's be honest, if I was just customer success or just product, I'd have a first ranking in how I care about what's happening. But because they're both underneath me, it helps me keep them on even footing. So it was sort of a happy accident, to be honest, for us.
That's fantastic. I'm curious as well too, because you mentioned how sometimes gaps in the product, and sometimes you can try and compensate a little bit. To what degree, as you're building out your product, you've got a product roadmap, do you also have a similar and integrated roadmap for how you're going to expand or evolve your CS services?
Yeah.
Is it totally aligned and integrated, or are they separate approaches, or how do you guys do it?
Yeah, again, when you come to that feedback, you're going to get product feedback where some of it is like, okay, there are no workarounds for this. Like, there's no way that the product can do this unless we do something to it. But then also, if you read between lines on feedback and on conversations you have between the teams, there is an opportunity to, to expand services. I'll give you a really specific example for us. Really very common thing we get asked for from our customers is they use the word templates. If I'm creating a playbook, for example, if I'm trying to build automation, I want to be able to pull up a template and, minimal thinking as possible, like show me the best practice. And so quite frankly, when my CS team first started asking for that, they were like, we need templates in the product. They used the same word that the customers were using. They went to their same mentality. But when the product team looked at that and they started asking questions around like, okay, what exactly do people want in these templates? And, where are the variations? And, what if you actually built out a template manually for someone, where do they change it? It led us into this different direction where we said, okay, we actually think templates, at least right now, are something that should live outside of the product, because we can have a very expansive, much more flexible library that we deliver through services than something that we have to reflect each and every change that we make in the product. Now, that's not to say that at some point we won't choose to bring those templates into the product itself. But to me, that's a lovely example of where, yeah, we could have just gone ahead and built out templates. But instead, there was a moment for services to step in, confirm the need. So not just immediately build, but rather confirm the need, confirm the specifics of the need, and even save us time, because we're being very successful with those templates outside of the system, and that allowed us to devote energy to something else on the product side.
That's great. And I think that, it's such a good example of, sometimes the best solution is not automation, is not in the tool.
Well, people will ask for something and it's not necessarily always in their best interest. And that's one thing I sort of had to keep coach CSMs on, as product people, were that skepticism, that objectivity is sort of, baked into us. With CSMs, it's the opposite. Like they're the best CSMs always believe their customers, are always invested in their customers. So teaching them some of that, being able to step back and see the broader picture and see multiple avenues for a fix, has been an interesting journey for us.
I think that change in the way that CSMs and anyone in customer success has to work. It isn't, you're not there just to say yes to a customer. And I think quite often, particularly kind of some of the younger people coming into success, they're less experienced. That's what you do, because you're just trying to keep your customer happy and keep them successful. But quite often it's understanding that bigger picture, and actually it's not the customer just wants this feature, it's what value does it give to them and why do they want it, and really digging deep. And I think it's instilling that product way of thinking. It really is.
It is. And so I coach that objectivity, the multiple ways to solve a problem for CS. I also think it's important for product to return the favor. Is that in the same way that CS has to learn to be objective, product has to learn to put a little emotion into it sometimes and feel the pain that's being felt by those customer-facing teams. There's lots of ways that a product team can go about trying to expose themselves to that, but the fact of the matter is that they're never going to get as much exposure to your customers as your customer-facing teams are. It's what they do all day. Yes. So I think there's a lot of learning back and forth that serves to make each team stronger. If you have a CS team that can be objective in the right moments, that's helpful. If you have a product team that can be emotional and connected to customers in the right moments, that's also helpful. They can share the burden there a bit.
Have you guys done anything about getting your product team better interfacing in touch with customers directly? It's something that I've seen a lot of success with, where I've worked in an organization where we had two very disparate teams. The product team reported to the CTO, success team was part of me, but the product team never engaged with customers. And ultimately what we did was get the kind of our executive business review meetings, we call them customer value reviews, but we did them in the office and got the customers to come in, got the product team to come in, and it really changed that relationship. So actually having the product team interfacing directly with the customers really added massive benefits to the business. Have you seen similar things?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing a product team can do to help themselves is to directly talk to customers as much as possible. And unfortunately, in my own experience, at various product roles in my career, and when I look at other organizations, a lot of product teams will have what they call a voice of the customer program, but the way they actually go about collecting that information is still really them-centric, if you will. Like when I get on a call with the customers, I got a list of things I want to ask, and I've gotten objective about what that call is. I'm not in listen mode. I'm not in learn mode. I'm not in watch mode. I'm just trying to farm for the specific nuggets of information that I want. So I think it's important for product teams to not just not like, oh hey, I'm going to do my once a year sit with customers, but it should be baked throughout what you do, and find opportunities like sit on support calls. go to customer success meetings, go to trainings, go to QBR reviews, sit in the back of a customer success team meeting quietly. And in all of these things, like, you are not there to participate, you are there to sponge and listen and try to understand the larger context that your product and that your services sit in, the actual problems that people are trying to solve, the challenges. We think there's one clear pathway to doing something. What offshoots are we missing because we don't live that day to day? So the more your product team can expose themselves to customers, it really is meaningful.
So if you've got an organization out there that one of your customers or prospects or someone you're talking with them, and it's clear that there's some disconnects between their CS and their product team, what are some of the and they want to address those, what are some of the first ways that you would recommend people get started? What's the right way to start to get things a little closer? Because I know in some organizations where I've been, it's almost a conflict situation and butting heads between departments. It's not always a healthy situation. And some places it's just everyone's so busy that they're running around like, chickens with their heads cut.
Yeah. It may sound a little cliche, but I think change only happens if it comes from the top down, or at least the real sort of kickstart to any change has to come from the top down. So, and I also think setting reasonable goals is important in achieving that change as well. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is that the leader of CS and the leader of product, which are usually two different people, they need to talk about what kind of relationship they want to have with one another and where they can help one another. How can this be a mutually beneficial relationship? And if we set a list of things that we could do to help us be more useful to one another, how can we tick those things off and sort of get those baby steps along the way? Like, you could think about all the things you could ever do to try to get those two teams aligned. And if you look at the full picture, you're never going to get anything done. So if you pick a couple of easy wins, and you want to make sure that their wins are going to feel like they actually move the needle though. So something where, we don't want either team to feel like they're just doing things to placate the opposite team. It needs to feel like it's bringing them some benefit. It's connecting them meaningfully with another team. I say start with the leaders though, because I've seen internal team members sort of try to scrap their way there on their own, which is beautiful and lovely. But if there isn't a culture of cooperation that comes from the leaders, I think how far they can go is going to be naturally truncated.
Sort of related to that, do you think it's easier to align the CS team with the product team or with the sales team?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think the type of alignment that needs to happen, if we really want to go for it all, I think you should have a triangle there a little bit, but that might be a separate conversation. I actually think in some ways it's a little easier to align with product, because ultimately the goals of those two teams are extremely, extremely similar. You want to get customers and keep them, and you want them to be successful. How you go about solving those two problems is very different, because what you control in that situation is different. But when you talk about what do they want to accomplish, those two teams should very rarely have different objectives. And it's not to say that sales and CS have necessarily different objectives, but it depending on how your sales organization is structured, it can very much sometimes feel like you have different objectives. And there is in both those scenarios, though, CS, sales to CS and product to CS, I think the interesting thing as someone in CS is that it can both feel like they're being done to you. You get a customer from sales and it's like, they might be terrible and you can't do anything about it. You get a product, a solution, an application from product, and you can't do anything about it if it's missing these things. So I think the tenets of what can make either relationship more successful comes down to acknowledging that there is sort of that natural down the hill mentality a bit, and make sure you're being a good actor in that scenario.
You talked before about the culture of cooperation. I love that phrase. I'm going to borrow it. And I think it is something that I always see customer success as almost like a facilitator. Quite often, it's about bringing different teams together. So this alignment with products is just great. How do you? Quite often, product is more closely aligned to an engineering function, or maybe under a CTO, or kind of with your development side over there. How have you found? Or have you seen any challenges with getting your product management team speaking to your engineering team so that they know how to set priorities and know what customers are saying? How have you gone about looking at that?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I mean, product serves a lot of roles during the development process, but the principal chief one that it serves is that you are there to speak for the business case. You are there to speak for the customer. And so, yes, day to day, there's a lot of nuances that go into that, trade-offs and exact features and, debates about how you exactly approach something, things you're typically doing with the engineering team. But I think what anchors product in that process is that if they're not there speaking for the customer, then we're missing a key component of what they're supposed to be doing. If we really want to push for it, I actually think it's really interesting to expose developers themselves a bit more to customers. Again, in listen-only mode, I'm not asking developers to suddenly feel like they know how to conduct a customer interview. That's certainly not
scares some developers, doesn't it?
Teams
not all of them.
All around. But again, I've never heard. Very rarely are people going to be like, I don't want information on how I can do what I do better. I actively want to reject things that are going to help me understand and produce a better product or produce a better solution. And developers are included in that. And I actually think it can be interesting because sometimes if it's only coming from product, I was going to say one, which sounds aggressive, but I have managed to bring people around to my way of thinking in an argument with a developer by presenting the customer themselves, whether it was a recorded call or an email or something that vouches for my point. So I think that can be an interesting exposure as well. No one's going to do worse because they understand more about what the customer needs.
Yeah, and I love what you say about having people observe in listen-only mode, because I've done that several times. And what I found also helps is, all right, you've been in listen-only mode, and now the customer has left the room. Now we're going to debrief as a group to make sure we all heard the same thing and process it the same way. And I've been amazed how many times people sat in the room and came away from the same conversation with very different perspectives.
Yeah, totally different things. It's not to say that all of them are wrong either. I think I was talking earlier about how CS, sometimes has emotion that they need to learn to control when it comes to, reacting to the product. I actually think the same can sometimes be true for product and dev teams as well. You get defensive. If you feel like there's a lot of information coming at you that things are wrong or not how they want, like you start to defend your decisions because it starts to feel like people are judging whether you're bad at your job. Like, why did you make these calls? And so I think putting out all the ideas is interesting because then you can start to self-select on where you didn't edit out your own emotional reaction to the situation. And even if you have an emotional reaction, that doesn't mean that there isn't still real value in there. Like, a developer being like, well, this customer just doesn't want to do X. Okay, sure, fine. And maybe that's annoying to you, but why don't they want to do X? Is it a lack of knowledge or a lack of comfort in that area? Like, what is it? Dig into why they don't want to do X. Because it is interesting, the variations that you can get. You want to have that conversation so you can agree on, 2-3 things that you walk away from it from. But I think starting from that larger group is really important.
Yeah. How is the org structure you guys have got? How has it impacted sales? Do sales feel less aligned to product because customer success is part of the product function there?
That would be an interesting question for me to ask my sales guys. I'm actually curious how they feel about that. Now, what I will say is that I try to do a lot of the same thing with sales that I do with customers because, yes, a lot of your product vision, your product roadmap should be customer centric. Yep. But, it is on the shoulders of product to drive growth at the organization as well, which means looking at competitive needs and, marketplace situation and where you can differentiate from other groups out there, which means there's not always necessarily people asking for something in particular, but you're doing that because you see this open potential. So some of the same sort of feedback things and, that I do with my CS team, I expose to the sales team as well. A, so that we feel, that culture of collaboration extends out even beyond my immediate teams. But B, because part of my roadmap is about, it is about expansion, not just about satisfying customers. And I think their, sales insight in that is critical. They, in the same way that I talk to customers way more than they do, they talk to prospects way more.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. So, we've talked a lot of different stuff here around how to get alignment and how important it is. And I love the practical tips. Once your groups are fairly well aligned, what does it take to keep them that way? Because, the world is not static and there's always turnover of staff and product growth and everything else. It's constantly changing. Well, how much energy do you devote to keeping it aligned, and what are some of the tips that you have there?
Yeah, I think it may sound strange, but I think formalizing what you do is really important, because if you have a formal process, even when there are changes in personnel and things like that, even as the team grows, it's harder to shake that and lose it in the process. And when I say formal, I mean like, so I'll see I'll talk to teams and they'll be like, okay, well, once a month we have a meeting with our product manager, and we get to talk to them about what we need during that meeting. And on the one hand, that might feel formal. Okay, there's a routine clip at which it happens. There's a meeting that happens. There's a goal for that meeting. But that's also one individual, one meeting, no other sort of connectors around it, no other feedback loops. So that one person leaves, that goes away, or it's not as easily replaced. So making sure that whatever you do is formalized enough that there's that if one or two people drop out of the process isn't dead. But also making sure that real data comes out of that process. Don't have a meeting just to stare at each other and share ideas and have product walk away with a list of stuff that they wrote down somewhere. Like, everybody needs to have data. My favorite thing to be able to do when I show a roadmap is to be like, I am putting this on the roadmap because I got X number of requests from customers, which equals Y amount of revenue. Like, that is powerful. As a product person, it's also powerful for my CS team to be able to say that to our customers and tell them that we saw that. So whatever you do, make sure that it's formal enough that it results in real usable data for the organization, for yourself, of course, but for the organization. That'll just make it harder to shake as things change and grow.
Wow, good stuff.
Do you see what do you see kind of the future for organizations? Do you think this alignment between product and CS, you will begin to see a trend? Do you think we'll see kind of more success being built into the product, that product being kind of leading the charge here more and more? Is it what you're seeing in the market when you're speaking to different organizations?
I certainly hope so. We have this idea that we are invested in here at Turn Zero, and we refer to it as customer success everywhere. Yeah. I think the type of customers that we deal with now, across multiple industries, but the type of customers we deal with now, they have these expectations about what they want out of any product that they buy. And certainly some of those things are features and functionality, but it's also just, how am I supported? How am I engaged? What are the right moments to talk to me about? What sorts of information? And I think the key to customer success long-term is trying to reduce friction in those relationships. So we love this idea of how can CSMs meet their customers where they're at. Yes, phone and email are never going to go away because that's still how we do a lot of business. But are there other ways that feel more natural to the customer, makes the customer success manager and your CS programs feel like a more organic part of their experience? I think that is really where it feels less like, oh, this person has emailed me and I got to go have my QBR because it's time, versus like, oh, there was a beautiful moment where I needed something. My behavior and my usage and my trends indicated that I needed something. And before I'd even verbalized that necessarily, I was getting that delivered to me. I mean, that is the very definition of proactive. That's sort of the holy grail that we're going for in customer success. And product inherently has to be involved in that because A, the data to support that is going to come from product. B, I actually personally, and Turn Zero overall, believes that there's a lot that CS should be able to do inside your product itself, talking to customers when they're using. Because at no point are they more ready to hear information, accept advice, try new things than when that's where their mind is at. If I'm getting an email or a phone call, I gotta hope that I'm in the right frame of mind to drop what I was doing and go try this thing that I just read about in an email. So I see a real future for CS inside the product itself, which means that connection between CS and product is just going to keep getting deeper. And even if you don't have that exposure within the product itself, I don't think you can produce customer-centric products or customer-centric services without those two teams being really, really on the same page.
Yeah. So I'm curious too, you mentioned a lot about feature requests and coming from your customers and figuring that out. Are you seeing a lot of requests coming from the customers these days asking for more functionality to help with their internal alignment between their CS team and their product teams? Or is it primarily, we're still just enabling our CS teams because that's where they are in their development?
I'm starting to see some bridges for sure, which is really, I get really, sort of geeked out when I see that sort of stuff. Exciting to me. Yeah, because, we get asked a lot about how we, just like you guys have done, like, how do we approach keeping those teams in mind? What do we do for feedback? I also think, so I've been talking a lot about feedback because, like I said, I think that's a great, meaningful place to start. But I also think we at product teams also often commit the sin of collecting feedback and then going dark until there's a product that occurs. So I think there's there's all these opportunities in the mix there to keep including your CS team and keep including customers themselves. The thing that always surprises me more and more about customers is that they really want to be participatory in what happens to them. Not all of them, but a lot of customers are really excited about the ability to see things when they're in development and give feedback. They love feeling like a company cares about what they think and about whether they can accomplish what they need with whatever's being developed. So I think if it goes all the way through the process, that's also particularly effective.
I think that's an interesting insight, because I think a lot of times increasingly you're seeing your vendors ask you for your opinion more than your internal management in some organizations.
Oh yeah, that's really fair. And I also think it's interesting sometimes to compare the voice of the customer you get from the customer themselves and the voice of the customer you get if you talk to a customer success team, and where you may or may not have the same things being said. Because I think interesting opportunities, stuff you may have not realized, things the CS team might have not even fully sussed out, can appear if you look at those two things kind of side by side.
Interesting. I haven't thought about that, but I bet that is very true. Awesome. Well, we're almost out of time here, so I guess just one last question here. Are there any last thoughts or recommendations that you have for anyone that is looking to better align their CS and their product team that we haven't covered, or any other things that we didn't think to ask you about, but this would really help a lot of people if they did this?
The last thing I'd like to leave with is just, if you heard something today that's inspiring you, like, go do something about it. I think in any type of change in an organization, sometimes we get overwhelmed by the magnitude of what it might take to do the whole thing and do it right. And a lot of change can be spurred by just, a few people being vocal, having ideas about how they can make a situation work. So if something caught your ear, go make a buddy in product, or, go make a buddy in CS, like, start somewhere, because that somewhere can lead to something really, really meaningful.
I think even for us, I'm speaking for Jason here, but there's lots of food for thought that you've given us here. I love the title alignment. I think is, it's not everything about a title, but I think you brought together that CS experience of the product experience is really, really fantastic to see. And I think I'd love to see more organizations thinking about it.
I hope so too. Fingers crossed. I like talking about this topic because, it brings together my two passions, that I get to explore in a very full way here at Churn Zero. But I do think it really has something there. And I think it can mean a lot for any business that wants to be super proud of the products and services it's putting out, is really coming back to customer-centric spot.
Wow.
Brilliant.
Well,
really
fantastic. Cool. Abby, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We really appreciate. Hope you liked it. If you have insights, we'll put some links to Churn Zero in the description below. And Abby, I hope you'll come back and join us again. We really appreciate all of your thoughts and insight. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Abby.